Section 3 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 3. Lord Monmouth, who detested popular tumults as much as he despised public opinion, had remained during the agitating year of 1831 in his luxurious retirement in Italy, contenting himself with opposing the Reform Bill by proxy. But when his correspondent, Mr. Rigby, had informed him in the early part of the spring of 1832 of the probability of a change in the tactics of the Tory party, and that an opinion was becoming prevalent among their friends that the great scheme must be defeated in detail rather than again withstood on principle, his lordship, who was never wanting in energy when his own interests were concerned, immediately crossed the Alps and travelled rapidly to England. He indulged a hope that the weight of his presence and the influence of his strong character, which was at once shrewd and courageous, might induce his friends to relinquish their half-measure, a course to which his nature was repugnant. At all events, if they persisted in their intention, and the bill went into committee, his presence was indispensable, for in that stage of a parliamentary proceeding proxies became ineffective. The counsels of Lord Monmouth, though they coincided with those of the Duke of Wellington, did not prevail with the waverers. Several of these high-minded personages had had their windows broken, and they were of opinion that a man who lived at Naples was not a competent judge of the state of public feeling in England. Besides, the days are gone by for senates to have their beards plucked in the forum. We live in an age of prudence. The leaders of the people now generally follow. The truth is, the peers were in a fright. 'Twas a pity. There is scarcely a less dignified entity than a patrician in a panic. Among the most intimate companions of Coningsby at Eton was Lord Henry Sidney, his kinsman. Coningsby had frequently passed his holidays of late at Beaumanoir, the seat of the Duke, Lord Henry's father. The Duke sat next to Lord Monmouth during the debate on the enfranchising question, and to while away the time, and from kindness of disposition spoke with warmth and favour, of his grandson. The polished Lord Monmouth bowed as if he were much gratified by this notice of one so dear to him. He had too much tact to admit that he had never yet seen his grandchild, but he asked him questions as to his progress and pursuits, his tastes and habits, which intimated the interest of an affectionate relative. Nothing, however, was ever lost upon Lord Monmouth. No one had a more retentive memory or a more observant mind. And the next day, when he received Mr. Rigby at his morning levee, Lord Monmouth performed this ceremony in the high style of the old court, and welcomed his visitors in bed. He said with imperturbable calmness, and as if he had been talking of trying a new horse, "Rigby, I should like to see the boy at Eton." There might be some objection to grant leave to Coningsby at this moment, but it was a rule with Mr. Rigby never to make difficulties, or at least to persuade his patron that he, and he only, could remove them. He immediately undertook that the boy should be forthcoming, and notwithstanding the excitement of the moment, he went off next morning to fetch him. They arrived in town rather early, and Rigby, wishing to know how affairs were going on, ordered the servant to drive immediately to the headquarters of the party, where a permanent committee watched every phasis of the impending revolution, and where every member of the opposition, of note and trust, was instantly admitted to receive or to impart intelligence. It was certainly not without emotion that Coningsby contemplated his first interview with his grandfather. All his experience of the ties of relationship, however limited, was full of tenderness and rapture. His memory often dwelt on his mother's sweet embrace, and ever and anon a fitful phantom of some past passage of domestic love haunted his gushing heart. The image of his father was less fresh in his mind, but still it was associated with a vague sentiment of kindness and joy, and the allusions to her husband in his mother's letters had cherished these impressions. To notice lesser sources of influence in his estimate of the domestic tie, he had witnessed under the roof of Beaumanoir the existence of a family bound together by the most beautiful affections. He could not forget how Henry Sidney was embraced by his sisters when he returned home, what frank and fraternal love existed between his kinsman and his elder brother, how affectionately the kind Duke had welcomed his son once more to the house where they had both been born, and the dim eyes and saddened brows and tones of tenderness which rather looked than said farewell when they went back to Eton. And these rapturous meetings and these mournful adieus were occasioned only by a separation at the most of a few months, softened by constant correspondence and the communication of mutual sympathy. But Coningsby was to meet a relation, his near, almost his only relation, for the first time. The relation, too, to whom he owed maintenance, education, it might be said, existence. It was a great incident for a great drama, something tragical in the depth and stir of its emotions. Even the imagination of the boy could not be insensible to its materials, and Coningsby was picturing to himself a beneficent and venerable gentleman pressing to his breast an agitated youth, when his reverie was broken by the carriage stopping before the steps of Monmouth House. The gates were opened by a gigantic Swiss, and the carriage rolled into a huge courtyard. At its end Coningsby beheld a Palladian palace with wings and colonnades encircling the court. A double flight of steps led into a circular and marble hall adorned with colossal busts of the Caesars. The staircase in fresco by Sir James Thornhill breathed with the loves and wars of gods and heroes. It led into a vestibule painted in arabesques, hung with Venetian girandoles, and looking into gardens. Opening a door in this chamber, and proceeding some little way down a corridor, Mr. Rigby and his companion arrived at the base of a private staircase. Ascending a few steps, they reached a landing place hung with tapestry. Drawing this aside, Mr. Rigby opened a door, and ushered Coningsby through an antechamber into a small saloon of beautiful proportions, and furnished in a brilliant and delicate taste. "You will find more to amuse you here than where you were before," said Mr. Rigby, "and I shall not be nearly so long absent." So saying, he entered into an inner apartment. The walls of the saloon, which were covered with light blue satin, held, in silver panels, portraits of beautiful women painted by Boucher. Couches and easy chairs of every shape invited in every quarter to luxurious repose, while amusement was afforded by tables covered with caricatures, French novels, and endless miniatures of foreign dancers, princesses, and sovereigns. But Coningsby was so impressed with the impending interview with his grandfather that he neither sought nor required diversion. Now that the crisis was at hand, he felt agitated and nervous, and wished that he was again at Eton. The suspense was sickening, yet he dreaded still more the summons. He was not long alone. The door opened. He started, grew pale. He thought it was his grandfather. It was not even Mr. Rigby. It was Lord Monmouth's valet. "Monsieur Coningsby?" "My name is Coningsby," said the boy. "Milor is ready to receive you," said the valet. Coningsby sprang forward with that desperation which the scaffold requires. His face was pale, his hand was moist, his heart beat with tumult. He had occasionally been summoned by Dr. Keate. That too was awful work, but compared with the present, a morning visit. Music, artillery, the roar of cannon, and the blare of trumpets may urge a man on to a forlorn hope. Ambition, one's constituents, the hell of previous failure, may prevail on us to do a more desperate thing, speak in the House of Commons. But there are some situations in life, such for instance as entering the room of a dentist, in which the prostration of the nervous system is absolute. The moment had at length arrived when the desolate was to find a benefactor, the forlorn a friend, the orphan a parent; when the youth, after a childhood of adversity, was to be formally received into the bosom of the noble house from which he had been so long estranged, and at length to assume that social position to which his lineage entitled him. Manliness might support, affection might soothe, the happy anguish of such a meeting; but it was undoubtedly one of those situations which stir up the deep fountains of our nature, and before which the conventional proprieties of our ordinary manners instantaneously vanish. Coningsby, with an uncertain step, followed his guide through a bedchamber, the sumptuousness of which he could not notice, into the dressing-room of Lord Monmouth. Mr. Rigby, facing Coningsby as he entered, was leaning over the back of a large chair, from which, as Coningsby was announced by the valet, the lord of the house slowly rose, for he was suffering slightly from the gout, his left hand resting on an ivory stick. Lord Monmouth was in height above the middle size, but somewhat portly and corpulent. His countenance was strongly marked, sagacity on the brow, sensuality in the mouth and jaw. His head was bald, but there were remains of the rich brown locks on which he once prided himself. His large deep blue eye, madid and yet piercing, showed that the secretions of his brain were apportioned half to voluptuousness, half to common sense. But his general mien was truly grand, full of a natural nobility of which no one was more sensible than himself. Lord Monmouth was not in dishabille; on the contrary, his costume was exact and even careful. Rising, as we have mentioned, when his grandson entered, and leaning with his left hand on his ivory cane, he made Coningsby such a bow as Louis XIV might have bestowed on the ambassador of the United Provinces. Then, extending his right hand, which the boy tremblingly touched, Lord Monmouth said, "How do you like Eton?" This contrast to the reception which he had imagined, hoped, feared, paralysed the reviving energies of young Coningsby. He felt stupefied; he looked almost aghast. In the chaotic tumult of his mind, his memory suddenly seemed to receive some miraculous inspiration. Mysterious phrases heard in his earliest boyhood, unnoticed then, long since forgotten, rose to his ear. Who was this grandfather, seen not before, seen now for the first time? Where was the intervening link of blood between him and this superb and icy being? The boy sank into the chair which had been placed for him, and leaning on the table, burst into tears. Here was a business! If there was one thing which would have made Lord Monmouth travel from London to Naples at 24 hours' notice, it was to avoid such a scene. He hated scenes. He hated feelings. He saw instantly the mistake he had made in sending for his grandchild. He was afraid that Coningsby was tender-hearted like his father. Another tender-hearted Coningsby! Unfortunate family! Degenerate race! He decided in his mind that Coningsby must be provided for in the church, and looked at Mr. Rigby, whose principal business it always was to disembarrass his patron from the disagreeable. Mr. Rigby instantly came forward, and adroitly led the boy into the adjoining apartment, Lord Monmouth's bedchamber, closing the door of the dressing-room behind him. "My dear young friend," said Mr. Rigby, "what is all this?" A sob was the only answer. "What can be the matter?" said Mr. Rigby. "I was thinking," said Coningsby, "of poor mamma." "Hush!" said Mr. Rigby. "Lord Monmouth never likes to hear of people who are dead, so you must take care never to mention your mother or your father." In the meantime Lord Monmouth had decided on the fate of Coningsby. The Marquess thought that he could read characters by a glance, and in general he was successful, for his natural sagacity had been nurtured by great experience. His grandson was not to his taste; amiable, no doubt, but spoony. We are too apt to believe that the character of a boy is easily read. 'Tis a mystery the most profound. Mark what blunders parents constantly make as to the nature of their own offspring, bred, too, under their eyes, and displaying every hour their characteristics. How often in the nursery does the genius count as a dunce because he is pensive, while a rattling urchin is invested with almost supernatural qualities because his animal spirits make him impudent and flippant. The schoolboy, above all others, is not the simple being the world imagines. In that young bosom are often stirring passions as strong as our own, desires not less violent, a volition not less supreme. In that young bosom, what burning love, what intense ambition, what avarice, what lust of power, envy that fiends might emulate, hate that man might fear. End of chapter 3. Book 1, chapter 4. "Come," said Mr. Rigby, when Coningsby was somewhat composed, "come with me, and we will see the house." So they descended once more the private staircase, and again entered the vestibule. "If you had seen these gardens when they were illuminated for a fête to George the Fourth," said Rigby, as crossing the chamber he ushered his charge into the state apartments. The splendour and variety of the surrounding objects soon distracted the attention of the boy for the first time in the palace of his fathers. He traversed saloon after saloon hung with rare tapestry and the gorgeous products of foreign looms, filled with choice pictures and creations of curious art, cabinets that sovereigns might envy, and colossal vases of malachite presented by emperors. Coningsby alternately gazed up to ceilings glowing with colour and with gold, and down upon carpets bright with the fancies and vivid with the tints of Aubusson and of Axminster. "This grandfather of mine is a great prince," thought Coningsby, as musing he stood before a portrait in which he recognised the features of the being from whom he had so recently and so strangely parted. There he stood, Philip Augustus, Marquess of Monmouth, in his robes of state, with his new coronet on a table near him, a despatch lying at hand that indicated the special mission of high ceremony of which he had been the illustrious envoy, and the garter beneath his knee. "You will have plenty of opportunities to look at the pictures," said Rigby, observing that the boy had now quite recovered himself. "Some luncheon will do you no harm after our drive," and he opened the door of another apartment. It was a pretty room adorned with a fine picture of the chase. At a round table in the centre sat two ladies interested in the meal to which Rigby had alluded. "Ah, Mr. Rigby," said the eldest, yet young and beautiful, and speaking, though with a fluency and a foreign accent, "come and tell me some news. Have you seen milor?" And then she threw a scrutinising glance from a dark flashing eye at his companion. "Let me present to your Highness," said Rigby with an air of some ceremony, "Mr. Coningsby." "My dear young friend," said the lady, extending her white hand with an air of joyous welcome, "this is Lucretia, my daughter. We love you already. Lord Monmouth will be so charmed to see you. What beautiful eyes he has, Mr. Rigby! Quite like milor." The young lady, who was really more youthful than Coningsby, but of a form and stature so developed that she appeared almost a woman, bowed to the guest with some ceremony and a faint sullen smile, and then proceeded with her Perigord pie. "You must be so hungry after your drive," said the elder lady, placing Coningsby at her side, and herself filling his plate. This was true enough, and while Mr. Rigby and the lady talked an infinite deal about things which he did not understand, and persons of whom he had never heard, our little hero made his first meal in his paternal house with no ordinary zest, and, renovated by the pasty and a glass of sherry, felt altogether a different being from what he was when he had undergone the terrible interview in which he began to reflect he had considerably exposed himself. His courage revived, his senses rallied, he replied to the interrogations of the lady with calmness, but with promptness and propriety. It was evident that he had made a favourable impression on her Highness, for ever and anon she put a truffle or some such delicacy in his plate, and insisted upon his taking some particular confectionery because it was a favourite of her own. When she rose, she said, "In 10 minutes the carriage will be at the door. And if you like, my dear young friend, you shall be our beau." "There is nothing I should like so much," said Coningsby. "Ah," said the lady with the sweetest smile, "he is frank." The ladies bowed and retired. Mr. Rigby returned to the Marquess, and the groom of the chambers led Coningsby to his room. This lady, so courteous to Coningsby, was the Princess Colonna, a Roman dame, the second wife of Prince Paul Colonna. The prince had first married when a boy, and into a family not inferior to his own. Of this union, in every respect unhappy, the Princess Lucretia was the sole offspring. He was a man dissolute and devoted to play, and cared for nothing but his pleasures and billiards, in which latter he was esteemed unrivalled. According to some, in a freak of passion; according to others, to cancel a gambling debt, he had united himself to his present wife, whose origin was obscure, but with whom he contrived to live on terms of apparent cordiality, for she was much admired, and made the society of her husband sought by those who contributed to his enjoyment. Among these especially figured the Marquess of Monmouth, between whom and the Prince Colonna the world recognised as existing the most intimate and entire friendship, so that his Highness and his family were frequent guests under the roof of the English nobleman, and now accompanied him on a visit to England. End of Book 1, Chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 5. In the meantime, while ladies are luncheoning on Perigord pie, or coursing and whirling britskas, performing all the singular ceremonies of a London morning in the heart of the season, making visits where nobody is seen, and making purchases which are not wanted, the world is in agitation and uproar. At present the world and the confusion are limited to St. James's Street and Pall Mall, but soon the boundaries and the tumult will be extended to the intended metropolitan boroughs. To-morrow they will spread over the manufacturing districts. It is perfectly evident that before 48 hours have passed, the country will be in a state of fearful crisis. And how can it be otherwise? Is it not a truth that the subtle chief baron has been closeted 1 whole hour with the king; that shortly after, with thoughtful brow and compressed lip, he was marked in his daring chariot entering the courtyard of Apsley House? Great was the panic at Brookes, wild the hopes of Carlton Terrace. All the gentlemen who expected to have been made peers perceived that the country was going to be given over to a rapacious oligarchy. In the meantime, Tadpole and Taper, who had never quitted for an instant the mysterious headquarters of the late Opposition, were full of hopes and fears, and asked many questions, which they chiefly answered themselves. "I wonder what Lord Lyndhurst will say to the King," said Taper. "He has plenty of pluck," said Tadpole. "I almost wish now that Rigby had breakfasted with him this morning," said Taper. "If the King be firm and the country sound," said Tadpole, "and Lord Monmouth keep his boroughs, I should not wonder to see Rigby made a Privy Councillor." "There is no precedent for an Under Secretary being a Privy Councillor," said Taper. "But we live in revolutionary times," said Tadpole. "Gentlemen," said the groom of the chambers, in a loud voice, entering the room, "I am desired to state that the Duke of Wellington is with the King." "There is a Providence!" exclaimed an agitated gentleman, the patent of whose intended peerage had not been signed the day that the Duke had quitted office in 1830. "I always thought the King would be firm," said Mr. Tadpole. "I wonder who will have the India Board," said Taper. At this moment 3 or 4 gentlemen entered the room in a state of great bustle and excitement. They were immediately surrounded. "Is it true?" "Quite true. Not the slightest doubt. Saw him myself. Not at all hissed. Certainly not hooted. Perhaps a little hissed. One fellow really cheered him. Saw him myself. Say what they like, there is reaction. But Constitution Hill, they say? Well, there was a sort of inclination to a row on Constitutional Hill, but the Duke quite firm. Pistols and carriage doors bolted." Such may give a faint idea of the anxious inquiries and the satisfactory replies that were occasioned by the entrance of this group. "Up guards and at them!" exclaimed Tadpole, rubbing his hands in a fit of patriotic enthusiasm. Later in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock, the high change of political gossip, when the room was crowded and every one had his rumour, Mr. Rigby looked in again to throw his eye over the evening papers, and catch in various chit-chat the tone of public or party feeling on the crisis. Then it was known that the Duke had returned from the King, having accepted the charge of forming an administration. An administration to do what? Portentous question. Were concessions to be made? And if so, what? Was it altogether impossible, and too late, stare super vias antiquas? Questions altogether above your tadpoles and your tapers, whose idea of the necessities of the age was that they themselves should be in office. Lord Eskdale came up to Mr. Rigby. This peer was a noble Croesus, acquainted with all the gradations of life, a voluptuary who could be a Spartan, clear-sighted, unprejudiced, sagacious, the best judge in the world of a horse or a man. He was the universal referee. A quarrel about a bet or a mistress was solved by him in a moment, and in a manner which satisfied both parties. He patronized and appreciated the fine arts, though a jockey, respected literary men, though he only read French novels, and without any affectation of tastes which he did not possess, was looked upon by every singer and dancer in Europe as their natural champion. The secret of his strong character and great influence was his self-composure, which an earthquake or a Reform Bill could not disturb, and which in him was the result of temperament and experience. He was an intimate acquaintance of Lord Monmouth, for they had many tastes in common, were both men of considerable and in some degree similar abilities, and were the two greatest proprietors of close boroughs in the country. "Do you dine at Monmouth House to day?" inquired Lord Eskdale of Mr. Rigby. "Where I hope to meet your lordship. The Whig papers are very subdued," continued Mr. Rigby. "Ah, they have not the cue yet," said Lord Eskdale. "And what do you think of affairs?" inquired his companion. "I think the hounds are too hot to hark off now," said Lord Eskdale. "There is one combination," said Rigby, who seemed meditating an attack on Lord Eskdale's button. "Give it us at dinner," said Lord Eskdale, who knew his man, and made an adroit movement forwards, as if he were very anxious to see the Globe newspaper. In the course of 2 or 3 hours these gentlemen met again in the green drawing-room of Monmouth House. Mr. Rigby was sitting on a sofa by Lord Monmouth, detailing in whispers all his gossip of the morn, Lord Eskdale murmuring quaint inquiries into the ear of the Princess Lucretia. Madame Colonna made remarks alternately to two gentlemen who paid her assiduous court. One of these was Mr. Ormsby, the school, the college, and the club crony of Lord Monmouth, who had been his shadow through life, travelled with him in early days, won money with him at play, had been his colleague in the House of Commons, and was still one of his nominees. Mr. Ormsby was a millionaire, which Lord Monmouth liked. He liked his companions to be very rich or very poor, be his equals, able to play with him at high stakes, or join him in great speculation, or to be his tools, and to amuse and serve him. There was nothing which he despised and disliked so much as a moderate fortune. The other gentleman was of a different class and character. Nature had intended Lucian Gay for a scholar and a wit. Necessity had made him a scribbler and a buffoon. He had distinguished himself at the University, but he had no patrimony, nor those powers of perseverance which success in any learned profession requires. He was good-looking, had great animal spirits, and a keen sense of enjoyment, and could not drudge. Moreover, he had a fine voice, and sang his own songs with considerable taste, accomplishments which made his fortune in society and completed his ruin. In due time he extricated himself from the bench, and merged into journalism, by means of which he chanced to become acquainted with Mr. Rigby. That worthy individual was not slow in detecting the treasure he had lighted on. A wit, a ready and happy writer, a joyous and tractable being, with the education and still the feelings and manners of a gentleman. Frequent were the Sunday dinners which found Gay a guest at Mr. Rigby's villa, numerous the airy pasquinades which he left behind, and which made the fortune of his patron. Flattered by the familiar acquaintance of a man of station, and sanguine that he had found the link which would sooner or later restore him to the polished world that he had forfeited, Gay laboured in his vocation with enthusiasm and success. Willingly would Rigby have kept his treasure to himself, and truly he hoarded it for a long time, but it oozed out. Rigby loved the reputation of possessing the complete art of society. His dinners were celebrated at least for their guests. Great intellectual illustrations were found there blended with rank and high station. Rigby loved to patronise, to play the minister unbending and seeking relief from the cares of council in the society of authors, artists, and men of science. He liked dukes to dine with him, and hear him scatter his audacious criticisms to Sir Thomas or Sir Humphrey. They went away astounded by the powers of their host, who, had he not fortunately devoted those powers to their party, must apparently have rivalled Vandyke or discovered the safety lamp. Now, in these dinners, Lucian Gay, who had brilliant conversational powers, and who possessed all the resources of boon companionship, would be an invaluable ally. He was therefore admitted and inspired both by the present enjoyment and the future to which it might lead. His exertions were untiring, various, most successful. Rigby's dinners became still more celebrated. It, however, necessarily followed that the guests who were charmed by Gay wished Gay also to be their guest. Rigby was very jealous of this, but it was inevitable. Still, by constant manoeuvre, by intimations of some exercise some day or other, of substantial patronage in his behalf, by 1,000 little arts which he carved out work for Gay which often prevented him accepting invitations to great houses in the country, by judicious loans of small sums on Lucian's notes of hand, and other analogous devices, Rigby contrived to keep the wit in a fair state of bondage and dependence. One thing Rigby was resolved on: Gay should never get into Monmouth House. There was an empyrean too high for his wing to soar in. Rigby kept that social monopoly distinctively to mark the relation that subsisted between them as patron and client. It was something to swagger about when they were together after their second bottle of claret. Rigby kept his resolution for some years, which the frequent and prolonged absence of the Marquess rendered not very difficult. But we are creatures of circumstances, at least the Rigby race particularly. Lord Monmouth returned to England one year and wanted to be amused. He wanted a jester, a man about him who would make him, not laugh, for that was impossible, but smile more frequently, tell good stories, say good things, and sing now and then, especially French songs. Early in life Rigby would have attempted all this, though he had neither fun, voice, nor ear. But his hold on Lord Monmouth no longer depended on the mere exercise of agreeable qualities. He had become indispensable to his lordship by more serious, if not higher, considerations. And what with auditing his accounts, guarding his boroughs, writing him when absent, gossip by every post, and when in England deciding on every question, and arranging every matter which might otherwise have ruffled the sublime repose of his patron's existence, Rigby might be excused if he shrank a little from the minor part of table wit, particularly when we remember all his subterranean journalism, his acid squibs, and his malicious paragraphs, and, what Tadpole called, his slashing articles. These slashing articles were indeed things which, had they appeared as anonymous pamphlets, would have obtained the contemptuous reception which in an intellectual view no compositions more surely deserved. But whispered as the productions of one behind the scenes, and appearing in the pages of a party review, they were passed off as genuine coin, and took in great numbers of the lieges, especially in the country. They were written in a style apparently modelled on the briefs of those sharp attorneys who weary advocates with their clever commonplace, teasing with obvious comment, and torturing with inevitable inference. The affectation of order in the statement of facts had all the lucid method of an adroit pettifogger. They dwelt much in extracts from newspapers, quotations from the Annual Register, parallel passages in forgotten speeches, arranged with a formidable array of dates, rarely accurate. When the writer was of opinion he had made a point, you may be sure the hit was in italics, that last resource of the forcible feebles. He handled a particular in chronology as if he were proving an alibi at the criminal court. The censure was coarse without being strong. and vindictive when it would have been sarcastic. Now and then there was a passage which aimed at a higher flight, and nothing can be conceived more unlike genuine feeling, or more offensive to pure taste. And yet perhaps the most ludicrous characteristic of these facetious gallimaufries was an occasional assumption of the high moral and admonitory tone, which, when we recurred to the general spirit of the discourse, and were apt to recall the character of its writer, irresistibly reminded one of Mrs. Cole and her prayer book. To return to Lucian Gay. It was a rule with Rigby that no one, if possible, should do anything for Lord Monmouth but himself; and, as a jester must be found, he was determined that his lordship should have the best in the market, and that he should have the credit of furnishing the article. As a reward, therefore, for many past services, and a fresh claim to his future exertions, Rigby one day broke to Gay that the hour had at length arrived when the highest object of reasonable ambition on his part, and the fulfilment of one of Rigby's long cherished and dearest hopes, were alike to be realised. Gay was to be presented to Lord Monmouth, and dine at Monmouth House. The acquaintance was a successful one, very agreeable to both parties. Gay became a habitual guest of Lord Monmouth when his patron was in England, and in his absence received frequent and substantial marks of his kind recollection, for Lord Monmouth was generous to those who amused him. In the meantime the hour of dinner is at hand. Coningsby, who had lost the key of his carpet bag, which he finally cut open with a penknife that he found on his writing table, and the blade of which he broke in the operation, only reached the drawing room as the figure of his grandfather, leaning on his ivory cane, and following his guests, was just visible in the distance. He was soon overtaken. Perceiving Coningsby, Lord Monmouth made him a bow, not so formal a one as in the morning, but still a bow, and said, "I hope you liked your drive." End of Book 1, Chapter 5.